This morning we're going to be talking about a tale of two cities. We find ourselves in Revelation 17 and 18 as we read about the city of man and its eventual collapse. As we've established, as we've been going through Revelation, through all of the confusing figures and symbols and themes throughout this complicated book, the one big takeaway I hope for you is that Revelation is ultimately about the victory of the King and his kingdom. At the end of the day, Revelation is a message that declares God wins and there is no Switzerland. God wins and there is no neutrality. Every week we see Revelation as a call to choose a side. But there is no third option throughout Revelation, either a part of the kingdom of God or a kingdom of this world. And as we'll see this morning, you're either a part of the city of God or the city of man. As we've been establishing each week, the theme of the kingdom is ultimately the theme of the Bible. But I think another important theme throughout the scriptures is the theme of the city. All throughout the scriptures, from Genesis to Revelation, we see this great theme of two cities, the city of God and the city of man. I don't have time to unpack all of that. I do want to commend to you a book called The City of God that I've mentioned before, and The Goal of Creation by T. Desmond Alexander, that fleshes out for us the theme of the city all throughout redemptive history. In Revelation 17 and 18, we see this unholy alliance that the city of man makes with the world, but its eventual downfall. It's the two cities that we will read about here in Revelation 17 and 18. Beginning in verse 3 of chapter 17, let's read together the story of the city of man. Verse 3 says, "And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names. It had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. On her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. I saw a woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. When I saw her, I marveled greatly. But the angel said to me, 'Why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the dwellers of the earth, whose name have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will marvel to see the beast, because it was, and it is not, and it is to come. This calls for wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated." Chapter 18, verse 1. "After I saw this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory, and he called with a mighty voice, 'Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all the nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her. The merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living.' And then I heard another voice from heaven saying, 'Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues, for her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Pay her back, as she herself has paid back others. Repay her double for her deeds. Mix a double portion for her in the cup she mixed. And she glorified herself and lived in luxury. So give her like measure of torment and mourning, since her heart, she says, I sit as a queen, I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. For this reason her plagues will come in a single day, death and mourning and famine. and she will be burned up with fire. For mighty is the Lord who has judged her. And the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. They will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come. And the grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our Lord, it stands forever. Amen. Do you remember several years ago, you might be watching a movie, and at the end of the movie, there was an option for special features. Maybe it had a different twist that you could choose. Maybe it had a different perspective, same story, but it may be a different angle than what you just watched. And it had 3 or 4 special features in which you could choose from. That's what's happening in Revelation. It's virtually the story over and over again of God's unfolding plan of redemption, but it seems like with each week in each chapter, it's all seen from a different perspective, but each perspective, it seems to grow in intensity. It seems that what John continues to see throughout the book of Revelation is the reality of the world, the reality of what is happening in and throughout the world. The tragedy that exists is growing in intensity and in perspective for the Apostle John. And so I want to point out a few things briefly from this perspective that John gets concerning the city of man. The first thing that we see in Revelation chapter 17 is the seduction of this city. The city of man in chapter 17 is personified as a prostitute. Now you might ask, why the need for hyperbole? Because I could sit here and we could read Revelation together and we could talk about the tragedies of the city of man and the tragedies of this world. But when I use the word prostitute, you seem to perk up. That was the intent of Revelation. It was to awaken the senses that living in the midst of the city of man is no joke. Living in the midst of the city of man is not child's play. And so it is likened to a prostitute, or some translations, a harlot, to wake you up to the realities of what we are standing against. And look at the description. If you see the description in chapter 17 in verse 1, a verse we didn't read, it says that the harlot or the prostitute is seated upon the waters. That was synonymous with having great authority over the entire cosmos. So this is an influence that has global domination as she sits on the waters. And then in verse 4, it describes this woman being dressed with purple, which is the symbol of kingship, of royalty, and with gold and jewels and all the luxuries of this world. Do you see what Satan does? He always seduces us with the finest things of this world. And so John is trying to reveal to us through Revelation that the city of man, do not be deceived, on the surface has all of the finer things that this world has to offer. And Satan is so seductive that he uses those things to seduce us into coming and being part of the city of man. And then finally, we read in chapter 17 and verse 5 that this harlot, this prostitute that is representing the city of man, has a name. And in verse 5, we're told that the name is Babylon the Great. Where have we seen this name before? 600 years before Jesus was born, Babylon was the great empire of the world. And Babylon came in to Jerusalem, the earthly city of God. Remember the city theme. Destroys the city of God, destroys the temple, the dwelling place of God, and carries the people of God off to Babylon in what is known as the Great Babylonian Captivity. And throughout all of human history, Babylon will serve as the biblical metaphor for the city of man. The city that will oppose the city of God. The city that will oppose God and the people of God. And so when we see the phrase Babylon the Great, we know that this is synonymous and a biblical metaphor for the powers of influence, the political, economic, social, and cultural powers of the world that have always stood against God and his people, personified as a dirty prostitute, to wake you up to the realities of what it means to live in the city of man. But then it continues in chapter 17. It says this prostitute is seated on a beast. Now, if you were here and paying attention a few weeks ago, we defined the beast. Who is the beast? The beast is the state. And in the first century, they would have understood that the beast of the sea, sitting on 7 mountains, is the city that sat on 7 mountains, Rome. They would have understood in the first century that the beast that empowers the harlot or the prostitute is the state. And so you have this ugly, unholy alliance between Babylon and Rome, between the city of man and the corrupted state, empowering this domination over the people of God. This ugly alliance that is personified as a prostitute. And all throughout history, it would be Babylon and Rome that would stand as the world powers that would curse, accuse, and oppose God and his people. It's interesting, in verse 6 of chapter 17, it says, I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. See, once again, using hyperbole. It could have easily said, the city of man put to death a lot of Christians throughout history, but instead uses the word drunk to get our attention, to show us the devastating realities of what the people of God have been up against all throughout human history. But then it says in verse 6, when I saw her, I marveled greatly. This is John. This is John who knew his Bible better than anyone. This is John, the same John whom it's written is the apostle whom Jesus loved. Why does John marvel? Maybe in your translation it says he's astonished. I believe that John, for the first time, as much as he knew Jesus, as much as he knew his Bible, for the first time, he saw the city of man for what it really was. And he said, if this is what we're up against, I don't know how the people of God can survive. Do you ever feel that way? Take comfort. Even the Apostle John felt that way. Marveled, astonished. How in the world can the people of God, the church, stand a chance if this is the seduction and the power of the city of man? Maybe you not only feel that in a general sense, maybe you feel that way this morning in a real personal sense. Maybe you're going through a personal tragedy or suffering and you are buying the seduction of the evil one and the lie of the evil one, where you just go, how in the world can I survive? But thank God the story doesn't end in chapter 17. Because not only do we see the seduction of the city of man, the second thing I want you to see is the fallout and the aftermath and the destiny of the city. The second thing I want you to see is the collapse of Babylon, the city of man. When we turn our attention to chapter 18, particularly the verses that we read, we see the sobering destiny, not only for the city of man, Babylon, but for all those that place their faith and their hope in this city. We see the aftermath, for instance, in verses 9 and 10. As the citizens of the city of man, those that refuse to place their faith and hope in God as the true king, it says in verse 19 that there is nothing but weeping, because the world at that moment is looking at everything they place their faith and hope in, They're looking at all of their dreams dashed, everything they invested in, all of the political power of the day and cultural power and all of the social and economic power, all of the lies of the city of man, everything they placed their hopes and dreams in a moment is just collapsing. It is a market crash of epic proportions. And there's nothing but weeping. Everything we've hoped in, crumbling. And the whole world weeps because they realize I bought the lie and I invested my entire life in the prostitute. And she destroyed me. And that is the hope. That is the only hope that we have. To recognize now on this side of heaven the lies of the prostitute, the lies of the city of man, and realize that there will be nothing but ruin in the end. The ironic reversal that the city of man stands before you today, offering hope, offering fulfillment, with all of its political and social and economic power, only to devour you in the end. I thank my good friend Rita for this analogy or this illustration just this week. You don't have to ask anybody that grew up under communism. Think of the utopian dream of communism. With all of its utopia, all of its dream promising freedom and liberation, only to devour the very people that it sought to free. The lies of the city of man. The devastation for those that place their hopes and dreams in the citizenship of this world. The collapse, the sobering collapse of the city of man. And the question this morning is, how in the world do we escape? How do we escape? How do we, like John, correct that thought? Correct our astonishment, correct our marveling at the city of man. How in the world will we survive as the people of God, called to be citizens of another city? Well, lastly, we see here the gracious call to come out of Babylon and come to the city of God. In verse 4, it says, "Then I heard another voice from heaven saying, 'Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins.'" In verse 4, it is the gracious calling of God. Before it is too late, before you suffer the punishment and the destruction of the city of man, there is a gracious call to come. If you're a teenager here this morning, I plead with you, come out of the city and come to the city of God. Regardless of what season or stage of life that you are in, there is a whole world out there convincing you to place your citizenship in the city of man, and I'm pleading with you to not buy that lie, but to come out of her, come out of Babylon, and come to the city of God. Notice it does not say to keep Babylon at an arm's length. It says escape from her. Run away from her. Come out of the city and be a city that is set apart. The Gospel of Matthew tells us that we are to be a city in the midst of a city, even a city on a hill. You say, Pastor, where's the city? You see, the people of God have always understood that life and history is all about two cities. That yes, you have the city of man, but we as the church are called to be the city of God, a city set on a hill, light in the midst of darkness, salt of the earth and light of the world. That is the calling, that the church of Jesus Christ is the city of God manifest here on earth. The imagery of Babylon reminds us that we are merely in exile, captives, but that our citizenship is in heaven. So what do we do with this morning? Is Revelation hard or what? I joked with the early service that I think in January I'm going to get one of those Mr. Rogers sweaters and just start reading out of some children's devotionals. I mean, this is complicated stuff. But I want you to see how relevant it is. What do we do with this message? 2 quick takeaways before we close this morning. Takeaway number 1. 10 times between chapter 17 and 19, we see the phrase a voice. I heard a voice. I heard a voice. I heard a voice. And you might be sitting there this morning saying, God, in this cultural moment, we need a voice. You're the voice. You are the voice. You are the voice with your citizenship in the city of God, crying out to the citizens of the city of man, saying, come. We are a come and see religion. Come and see. Come out of Babylon and come to the city of God. You are the voice in this cultural moment. And oh, how we need men and women and boys and girls who understand that their citizenship is not in the city of man, but their citizenship is in the city of God. And they say, come out, come out, come out. I'm pleading with you to come out. Takeaway number 2, we live with a holy commitment. You see, grace and law are not opposed to each other. When someone is transformed by the grace of Jesus Christ, it produces within them a desire to live set apart, a desire to live righteous and holy, that we look at our lives honestly every day and ask the question, do my ethics and values, whether I'm a high school teenager or I'm nearing the end of my life, does my life reflect citizenship in the city of God? Isn't it ironic that Jerusalem in the first century, once called the city of God, had become more like the city of man? The church in North America today, if we are truly to be the city of God, unfortunately, looks more like the city of man. We need a wake-up call, a call to live set apart as citizens of a greater city. It means that if we are to live as citizens of the city of God, it will be a rejection of the materialism and consumerism of the city of man. And we will respond with radical generosity because we will see the city of man for what it is, and we will say, I will invest in the city of God and his kingdom because evil will be destroyed. This is the calling, to reject the ethics and the values of the city of man. It means to be a citizen of the city of God that we will reject the sexual ethics and values of the city of man. And we will look our children in the eye and we will say, we will not allow the city of man to devour you. But we will believe in a sexual ethic and a value that is reflective of citizenship in a greater city. And we will not allow our children to be devoured in this cultural moment. This is what it means to be a citizen of the city of God. It means that we look different and we act different and we talk different. It means that we work hard all week with excellence and we show up to church on Sunday morning so that the people say, you worked hard all week, take the day off, and you say, no, I'm gathering with the other citizens and we're going to fix our eyes on Jesus. We realize that we're exiles and pilgrims, but only for a short while, because we're marching to Zion. This is the calling. Listen to me. If there was ever a moment that we needed the church to stand up, and we needed the church to say no to the city of man and yes to the city of God, it is now. That our citizenship is in a city called heaven. And that as a child of God, I believe that you have given me everything to endure as a citizen in this life and in the life to come. So where do we find our hope? What confidence do we have in exile and in captivity as pilgrims? It's in the gospel. Because it's in the gospel of Jesus Christ that we are told of the perfect Son of God who left his throne in heaven and came down and entered into the darkness of captivity and exile, and even suffered persecution and even fell under the sword, so that you and I could live with confidence that this exile and this captivity will only last for a short time, and this exile and captivity won't destroy us. That Jesus suffered so that I know with confidence that no amount of suffering will crush me or even destroy me. There are people here this morning that need to say no to the city of man and yes to the city of God. There are people here this morning and watching at home that need to know that the invitation this morning is for you to come out of Babylon and come into the city of God. That you, through Jesus Christ alone, can be washed of the prostitute, can be washed of the harlot, the filthy life of giving your whole life over to Babylon, and that you can enter into the first time citizenship in the city of God. This promise is for you simply by believing in Jesus Christ. You're being called to a new citizenship, a citizenship in the city of God. Last month, we recognized 20 years of 9/11. And I mentioned a few weeks ago that TV was flooded with documentaries and stories of heroism. And one name that should ring a bell is Todd Beamer. Todd Beamer was one of the men on Flight 93 that was headed for Washington, D.C., but ended up crashing in central Pennsylvania. Todd Beamer was a Christian. He was a quarterback at Wheaton College. And as he saw what was happening on Flight 93, and everyone around him started calling on the phones on the back of the seats, he decided to call home and call to his wife. He couldn't get through to his wife, but instead was connected to an operator. And he said, "I want you to tell her that I love her. I want you to tell her that I was thinking of her. But I don't want you to hang up. Tell me what's happening." And the operator started to describe what was happening around the country. The operator announced that we are a nation under attack. And Todd Beamer told the operator, "This plane's not going to Washington. There's several of us that are going to storm the cockpit. This plane's going down. But I want you to pray with me." And Todd led her in the Lord's Prayer. Could you imagine the poise? Could you imagine in that moment, the end of your life? And you pray this prayer, "Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done where? On earth as it is in heaven." That is citizenship in the city of God. And right before he stormed the cockpit, the last words heard from Todd Beamer's mouth were, "Let's roll." Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church, with our citizenship firmly planted and secured in the city of God, empowered by the gospel and fueled by the Holy Spirit, let's roll.